I spoke to you yesterday about normalcy bias, which is a fascinating psychological phenomenon from which I think we all suffer at times, not all the time, of course. I was trying to think what the opposite of normalcy bias is, and it's probably hyperbole. So normalcy bias describes a desire to disbelieve or minimize threat warnings. So you are presented with something that makes you go, oh my God, that's that. And then you automatically, there's some form of psychological self-preservation kicks in and you start, no, it can't be that bad. It can't I don't mean false equivalence. I don't mean BBC style two-siding facts. Here's Andrea Leadsom to claim that, the moon is made of cheese type of balance. I mean, trying to talk yourself out of thinking, fearing, believing that what you're looking at is apocalyptic, what you're looking at is deadly serious. And of course, I think the opposite of that is hyperbole. Because hyperbole involves saying that something is apocalyptic and something is deadly serious when it isn't. And we have to walk this tightrope together at the moment. I thought perhaps we were putting these days behind us when Keir Starmer got elected. I don't know how naive that was in retrospect, thinking that we're returning to days of relative stability and normality as opposed to normalcy. You're not going to have a barefaced liar in the House of Commons. I mean, abandoned by his entire party, found to have lied repeatedly and then running off with his tail between his legs to the Daily Mail. You just presume there'll be stability. And good God, there is. Thank goodness we have somebody who, though flawed and fallible, is clearly not a pathological liar, for example, or an incurable narcissist in number 10 Downing Street, or Liz Truss. I haven't got the adjective, sorry, sue me. But you cannot for a minute underestimate the import of the moment that we find ourselves in. It's incredible, this. This is not a moment for worrying about hyperbole. This is a moment for worrying about normalcy bias. This is a moment where you have to try to silence the voice in your head that is saying, this is really bloody serious. Now, Donald Trump is lying on a scale that is almost impossible to compute. And he's not just lying. He is the online Kremlin propaganda made flesh. He is repeating the lines that your Auntie Doris's Facebook has been serving up for the last 10 years about Ukraine being responsible for its own invasion. Remember when Farage spoke about, you don't poke the Russian bear? That pro-Kremlin propaganda has seeped into so many corners now of the online world that it has, again with Trump, you don't know whether he is caught up in it or simply harnessing it for his own ends. But he is absolutely, as Sir Ben Wallace said this morning to Nick Ferrari, he is absolutely parroting Kremlin propaganda lines or propaganda lies, whatever you prefer. And that is incredible. That is not a moment for worrying about hyperbole. That the President of the United States of America is peddling Kremlin pro-Putin propaganda. It's extraordinary. Now, it's one of those mornings where I always feel like the kid in The Sixth Sense seeing dead people. I don't see links that don't exist, but I have a few stories that are not immediately, obviously relevant to what we need to talk about this morning. The first involves Elon Musk. Quite briefly, because I think this is important in terms of what people do online, what people see and what people end up believing. Elon Musk reposted an image of what the original poster said was a hospital in Birmingham in the United Kingdom being overrun by migrants storming the premises with axes and knives. The account, which is the kind of thing that Twitter is now almost entirely dedicated to, claimed that the picture had been taken in Birmingham and that the story was buried on mainstream media. That poor woman that I eavesdropped on in Hounslow last week was adamant that the mainstream media never gives you the full story. The woman who believes that Michelle Obama is a man and that Vladimir Zelensky spends all the military aid he receives on yachts. I can laugh at her, but the President of the United States of America is now signed up to exactly the same feed. So Elon Musk shares this picture. shares this claim. Mainstream media are ignoring it. Would you like to know where the footage came from? The footage that was being described as migrants wielding axes and knives storming a hospital in Birmingham that had been buried on mainstream media. It is widely believed, I mean, it's clearly fake. It appears to be from the Batman film The Dark Knight Rises. So it wasn't Birmingham, it was Gotham City. It wasn't real, it was cinematic. And that's Elon Musk, arguably the second most powerful man in the world at the moment. Certainly the richest, using his own propaganda machine to tell you and anybody else on that site that Birmingham hospitals are being overrun by migrants wielding knives and axes. How many people believe it? With that woman I overheard in Hounslow last week when I was on jury service, does she believe it? I suspect she probably does. And then you come to the Romanian election, which is something we should probably all be reading up on rather more, because it's almost the distillation of a lot of the problems that we face. So the last Romanian election was annulled because when the results started coming in, two people, a chap called Salin Georgescu and a woman called Elena Lasconi, were performing incredibly well, despite the fact that certainly in the first case, nobody had ever heard of them prior to the election. And this is where things get really tricky, because it was the Constitutional Court that annulled the first round results, citing Article 50, Paragraph 3 of Romania's electoral law, which allows for annulment if significant fraud or interference likely impacts the election's outcome. And what they discovered was a slate of coordinated misinformation campaigns on social media. But of course, this was done secretly. Russian-sponsored. What Elon Musk is doing now is, shrugging off any semblance of secrecy, sharing it. And they do what Farage did after he used Andrew Tate as his news source prior to last summer's riots. They say, just asking questions. What's going on here? Not doing the most cursory of checks to see whether this stuff is true, but spreading misinformation on a hideous level. Social media, cyber attacks, influencing public opinion in Georgescu's favour. So I've seen him described as a TikTok puppet, with the Kremlin pulling all of the strings, but pulling them so effectively on TikTok for people primed to believe things that aren't true that they end up voting for him. The investigation, which of course is why a certain type of pundit and politician likes nothing more than attacking judges, because judges are, in some ways, our last line of defense against dictators and fascists, against oppression. That is why courts decide to annul an election because a foreign state has clearly targeted them. They wanted a pro-Kremlin candidate or even a pro-Kremlin proxy in charge or in the Romanian presidency. It's not clear-cut for me, this. That's probably the single greatest flaw with democracy, is that people who believe something that isn't true can win. Who just thought of Brexit? So you say, so Democrat, it's the will of the people, but it's the will of people who've been fed a diet of undiluted nonsense and lies. But democracy is the best system we've got. How we cope with democracy's vulnerability to the fact that you can have a win for liars, you can have a majority of people who believe things that aren't true, I do not know, because I don't think it's ethically or even politically clean cut that the Constitutional Court in Romania should have annulled this election, that this, quotes, will of the people. So we pull that together. We have the events in Ukraine unfolding. We have the events in Romania. We have the events online. We have all of these things unfolding in real time in front of us. And then you have Donald Trump overnight making it absolutely clear what his relationship with observable facts is, what his relationship with the truth is. And this is why I began this morning by talking about normalcy bias and hyperbole. Normalcy bias is a cognitive bias which leads us to believe things that aren't true because we're frightened of them being true, to disbelieve or minimize threat warnings. Hyperbole is a device we deploy best understood as exaggeration. So here is somebody saying something, oh my God, that's like Hitler. Sounds like hyperbole until it is like Hitler. And when it is like Hitler, normalcy bias kicks in and we start trying to talk ourselves out of that grim conclusion. So just listen to it for yourself and possibly register what kicks in first. Fear of hyperbole or fear of normalcy bias?
I want to see peace. Look, you know why I want? Because I don't want all these people killed anymore. I'm looking at people that are being killed, and they're Russian and Ukrainian people, but they're people. Doesn't matter where they're from on the whole planet. And I think I have the power to end this war. And I think it's going very well. But today I heard, oh, well, we weren't invited. Well, you've been there for 3 years. You should have ended it 3 years. You should have never started it. You could have made a deal. I could have made a deal for Ukraine that would have given them almost all of the land, everything, almost all of the land, and no people would have been killed, and no city would have been demolished, and not one dome would have been knocked down. This could have been settled very easily. Just a half-baked negotiator could have settled this years ago. When they're worried about not being seated, you mean somebody that should have gone in and made a deal a long time ago? You could have made a deal. This is one that could have made a deal. There was no talk of this during the Trump administration. Putin would have never, ever done it.
10:15 is the time. So there it is. Donald Trump has blamed Ukraine for being invaded by Russia twice. Donald Trump has claimed that Vladimir Zelensky is somehow responsible for the continuing carnage that has come about as a consequence of him defending his sovereign territory from the rapacious, imperial, murderous ambition of Vladimir Putin. It's incredible. So what question do we ask this morning? I mean, there's one in the back of my mind that I am frightened to articulate. The other element of domestic politics that pops into my brain at this moment is the mockery of Kemi Badenoch. But she has clearly calculated that appealing to this radicalized online right who believe all manner of lies is going to deliver political success for her in the way that it has done for Donald Trump and may yet do for other far-right, I mean avowedly far-right political movements in other European countries. When Americans tell lies about Britain, often racist lies about Britain, it's designed to scare the horses. It's to make people think, gosh, I better, Donald Trump can protect us. We won't end up like this, even if it's not true, the thing that they're frightened of. They do it about their own country, but about foreigners in their own country. They're eating the cats, they're eating the dogs. And I will protect you from these marauding hordes, these foreigners. Look at what's happened in Europe. What I don't understand is how anybody who is living in Europe can join in. It is arguably the least patriotic act imaginable when a foreign politician tells lies about your country to agree. So when Kemi Badenoch talks about Western values being imperiled, disappearing under threat, maybe she's a member of the radicalized online right. Maybe she believes all this stuff, spends so long on social media that she can't even find the time to stick her head out of the window and just have a little look around. But that is where we are now. And the question I don't want to ask you is whether or not it's already too late. Whether or not Vladimir Putin has actually won. And Ukraine is just the final piece of the evidence jigsaw. Because for the President of the United States, expressing disappointment that the Ukrainian leader was unhappy about being left out of talks between the US and Russia over the ending of the war in his own country, when he talks about Ukraine's ability to have made a deal in order to have somehow averted war in the very beginning, when he essentially repeats Kremlin lies about the necessity and inevitability of invading, you kind of think that it's for one part of this board, if it were a game of Risk, that's over now. The Kremlin and the White House are aligned. And yet Ukraine was a moment of, I'm going to say, political beauty in this country. I know that there are caveats, but forget the caveats just for a minute. The effort that the people of this country, the citizenry of this country, put into helping refugees, even when the government didn't really step up to the plate very effectively, ordinary people did. Like the kinder transport, the government, history doesn't often relate this, but the government was pretty delinquent when it came to helping Jewish children out of Nazi-occupied Europe. But real people, families, stepped up to the plate, made financial pledges and housed and homed people. And the Ukrainian refugee exodus was, I think, possibly the biggest we've ever undertaken in this country. People listening to this program from Ukraine, still living here. People listening to this program still got refugees living in their house from Ukraine. Everyone agreed. It was a moment of political unity at a time when we thought such a thing had become impossible in the aftermath of Brexit, in the midst of ludicrous confected culture wars, in the dog days of footballification. Ukraine was the thing we all agreed on. Putin is a menace. Ukraine deserves support. And now the President of the United States, historically our greatest ally, is saying the polar opposite. It's all Zelensky's fault, and he's got no right to be at the peace talks. Is it? You never stop fighting. You can't stop fighting. You can't look into the eyes of people like Marina Litvinenko or Vladimir Kara-Murza or Yulia Navalny, as I have done in the last 6 months, all three of them. You can't look into the eyes of those people and say, we need to stop now. We need to give up. But this is, I think, a victory for the Kremlin on a scale that we can't even begin to properly process. So what the hell do I ask you at 10:20 on a Wednesday morning? I genuinely don't know. I know I say that a lot of mornings. My normalcy bias is preventing me from asking you whether or not it's too late. So if I ask you whether it's too late, it opens the door to the possibility that you tell me that it is. And I don't want to do that because of my normalcy bias. But I said at 10 o'clock, today's a day for ignoring the normalcy bias. You have to. You have to drown that voice out. Champagne corks are popping in the Kremlin, said my good friend Bill Browder, who knows more about the Kremlin's kleptocracy than almost anybody else alive on Newsnight a couple of nights ago. Champagne corks are popping in the Kremlin. Actually, I think it was last night. Is that it? Is it? I mean, what does this mean? 0345 6060 973. How bad is it? 0345 6060 973. Has Putin won the second Cold War? 0345 6060 973. What the hell should we do now? What should Keir Starmer do? What should Europe do? What can Europe do? What will Europe do? How did it happen? 0345 6060 973. How did it happen? And I think you need to have a look at the Elon Musk tweets about Birmingham and the Romanian election. How did it happen? Enough people in the West have swallowed the propaganda of the East. It's as if in the 1980s we had somehow watched Ronald Reagan turn up in Moscow and bend the knee and say, do what you want in Afghanistan, for example. I mean, it is absolutely extraordinary. And I don't think that's hyperbole. What does it mean? 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. And the best way, if you are a victim of this propaganda campaign, and an awful lot of people are, not just the lady I sat next to in Hounslow last week. You can just see it all over social media. You heard Nigel Farage years ago warning about poking the Russian bear, as if somehow that justifies the invasion. We had a caller on the program earlier this week, actually, talking about poking the Russian bear. It's ludicrous. The bear is eating you already. The idea that fighting back is somehow a provocation is pathetic and dangerous. Make no mistake about that. But what does it mean for the rest of us?